returned from Vietnam. He went to Vietnam recently as sort of a completion. And maybe, Brian, you could start with that if you want to, if you will.
Well, I'm not sure that I want to start out saying what I saw in Vietnam, but I never know what I'm going to say when I'm at a microphone. But this is maybe the 8th or 9th film I've been to. I really don't watch the films anymore. I mean, it's a little bit boring, really. But we had our premiere in Portland on July 3rd at the Clinton Street Theater, in which we filled the theater and standing room only, and it was first time I'd seen it on a big screen with the sound system of a theater, and it was so much different than watching it on a television with a DVD player. And then when we went to Oakland, at the Grand Lake Theater, if anybody's been to the Grand Lake Theater in Oakland, it's this beautiful 1924 theater that's just incredible with a huge marquee. And they had even a better sound system and a better screen than I'd seen ever before. And it was amazing what a different experience it was to see it in that theater. So I'm just getting used to the different venues and the different experiences based on the sound, and I don't know anything about technical stuff. In fact, some of the screenings we've been at, we didn't have the right chords and the right machine, and it took us like 20 minutes to figure out how to get the film up. I will say that a little bit about Vietnam. I did go to Vietnam in April with Becky. Organized a little delegation with me and 2 other veterans. And we were there almost a month. And it's the first time I've been back voluntarily since I was involuntarily sent there in 1969. And it was quite an incredible experience. I was kind of shocked that many of the Vietnamese now want to be like U.S. Americans. And they want fast food. They have almost all the fast food joints you can think of here are there. Starbucks came in the months we were there. And you know, it was kind of depressing. I'm trying to get away from the culture, and then I go to Vietnam, and I'm immersed back into the seduction of the U.S. American culture. And I was also shocked that very few young people in Vietnam know anything about the history of the war. And wherever we went, people said, we look to the future, we don't dwell on the past, which I don't know if, in my mind, that doesn't work very well for me, but I'm not able to, nor should I judge any Vietnamese for how they think and how they're living their life. But we saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the thousands and thousands of third-generation birth defect children from Agent Orange. There's somewhere between 500 and 600,000. There's 300,000 tons of unexploded ordnance still in the country. And when Obama, I call him, went back to Vietnam in May, what did he do? Of course, Vietnam is one of our partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in the TPP. And what he did was he lifted the arms embargo so they could start buying jet fighter planes from Lockheed Martin. No apologies about the unexploded ordnance or for 21 million gallons of Agent Orange that was sprayed, or 21 million gallons of herbicides, of which most of that was Agent Orange. And Monsanto has offices now in Hanoi and in Ho Chi Minh City, one of the manufacturers of Agent Orange. So this neoliberal economic religion is pretty much everywhere now on the planet. And that's depressing to me. But the Vietnamese completely welcomed us, and it's a very collective society, unlike our society. They will become more individualistic as they become more materialistic, but they're a very collective society, very Buddhist. And I was able to meet with ex-fighters of the NLF, which we called the VC, and at least 6 ex-North Vietnamese soldiers, including officers. And the 3 of us who were veterans, we had what we call apology ceremonies. We actually apologized to the Vietnamese for having been on the wrong side. We said that if we had known then what we know now, we would have been fighting against the U.S. I mean, you know, that was kind of how we feel deep down inside of us, even though we likely would not have gone over there at the time. But they all clapped, and they all appreciated the fact that they knew that we had paid our own price going there, working, you know, having been sent there by our government. And they appreciated the fact that ex-U.S. fighters would go back and talk to them and say, we're really sorry that we participated in destroying 13,000 of your 21,000 villages and killed 5 to 6 million of your residents and your citizens. I mean, it's not even graspable what we did to the Vietnamese. It's not graspable what we did to the Native Americans over the last 500 years. So, you know, it's coming to grips as the Mother Earth has a fever. You know, the fever is in response to the infection of us. Burning carbon. We burn carbon from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. It fuels our whole lives all day long and cools or heats our house all night long while we're sleeping. And the Earth is responding now in a way that we can't ignore. And the warming I think of as a fever. And we, as a species, could join her immune system by undergoing a radicalization of our own consciousness. Because nature does bat last. And we will not prevail with our arrogant sense of our exceptionalism, our sense of superiority. And when we were having conversations with the Vietnamese, we would talk about these kinds of things. But I think they were down for so long, and they were so, we had done such a good job of destroying their ecology and their village culture. And we had an embargo on them from 1975 to 1994, the strictest embargo, even more strict than against Cuba. You know, now they want to have their time, and who am I to judge them for that? But I just know that it's kind of, to me, it's like it's part of this runaway neoliberal economics that captures us all, kind of captures most of the people of the world. And it's based on carbon. It's based on burning carbon. And you look up at the poles in the electric poles, and every corner in Saigon or in Hanoi or in Da Nang or Hue, you see thousands of wires at the top of that pole. You can just see how this is all going to collapse at some point. We're just more and more wires, more and more electrons, because all of this neoliberal monergism is built on electricity that's generated by burning some kind of a fossil fuel or processed uranium. So it was an eye-opening experience. And I went back to the base I was at, where I was the night security commander in 1969, and it's not there, you know. But what is there is the Can To International Airport with the same runway configuration when I was there, when we were protecting that runway. But it's a very modern building, and So for the Vietnamese, it's a wonderful thing that they can modernize like this. But I'm still kind of processing what it all means for the world, what the U.S. model means for the world and how it's impacting the whole world, and how a lot of people now are rising up. And the Standing Rock Sioux Rise Up is incredibly powerful. And there's a whole lot of people. I think there's a lot of people from Eugene that are there. There's a lot of people from Portland that are there. And so that is very exciting, that all through history, when people will only stay on bended knee for so long before they rise up. I mean, it's just at some point you no longer accept the repression or the lies or the deceit. And maybe this year's presidential campaign, which is a theater of the absurd, like all of our elections are, it's such a distraction from more creative revolutionary thinking that we get so caught up in this absurdity. And whoever wins, of course, is just a spokesperson for the cabal of the military-industrial complex. They're not really able to address the needs of the people. Only we can, in a sense, rise up to do that. Only we as human beings can do it. Not through the structures that we've been taught to abide by and kiss their ass and vote for them. We just validate their sense of power by doing that. So, you know, both the political parties are in collapse. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in collapse, and that's great. And the question is, how is this a turning point in human history? We have people all over the world really are beginning to separate themselves from nation states and becoming more self-reliant. The Standing Sioux are a wonderful example of both perpetuating a traditional way of life and obstructing business as usual. Obstructing business as usual is so important now. Obstructing business as usual as we then regroup as to how are we going to reconfigure our lives locally in a social way that makes sense for us and the environment. Maybe you have some questions or comments or critiques of the film. This is not my film. You have to understand there's a guy named Beau Boudart who made this film. It's not my film. I don't schedule it. I don't sell it. We've been through 7 drafts together, and I've always critiqued it. I've had issues with every draft. This is the final draft, although there's another draft that's 14 minutes shorter than this, but it's basically the same film. So I'm always interested to know what people think of the film and what they might have to say about the film or my own participation in the film. I mean, you know, really the title should be "And Voices from the Peace Movement." And that's another thing I've been discussing with a filmmaker. Should say the story of S. Brian Willson and Voices from the Peace Movement, because it's much broader than about me. So at any rate, if you have issues or questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Since nothing has really been reformed in terms of the war system in this country, don't you think there's likely to be another major war in 5 or 10 years? What should we do now to stop that from happening 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, of course, our system, our political economy, is dependent upon wars. That's how it makes its money. It needs wars. It needs to create pretexts for wars, which it does very easily. And we have a dumbed-down population that's so busy paying off their debts and just trying to survive. It's almost like it's hard to have an independent, critical mind. But there are critical minds, and some of them are right here in this room. But you know, I think that Hillary Clinton really wants to have a war with Russia. I mean, she's just doing everything to taunt the Soviets because of these 30,000 NATO troops right on the Soviet border, which is, you know, when the U.S. had promised Russia that we would not extend NATO east towards the the Russian border some time ago. I mean, the system thrives on militarism. It thrives on war. It profits immensely on war. So I don't know about 5 or 10 years from now. I just know that we're kind of in an endless war situation, covertly, overtly. And I think the only thing that can stop it is the rising up of the people of the United States. Not the political system, not the election system, but some kind of a historic, evolutionary shift in the consciousness that recognizes we've all been duped. We've all been validating a system that does not serve us. We've become addicted, like I have, to a way of life that requires carbon and a lot of cash. And we need to figure out how to replace community, how to replace money with community. And that is I don't know if you can quite organize it, but there comes a ripe moment in history when things happen because they're ripe. Like Occupy in 2011. That was not planned. It was a spontaneous 2,700 camps in the U.S., all starting in late September, going until they were evicted in mid-November. But that was a reflection of some kind of a reservoir of anger because the system is not responding to the needs of the earth or the people. So I think I know we're capable. We're capable of a rising up, which means going outside any envelope that we've been in so far, because our survival requires it. Whether we will or not, I don't know. And I don't know what I'm going to do. But I just know that we are totally capable of radical shifts in the way we think and live. And at this point in history, it's indispensable if we want to survive, even with fewer numbers, because the earth is going to dwindle our numbers. The earth is finite, and we're already got too many people consuming too much, all of which is dependent upon gouging resources out of the literal earth itself and then burning it. So it's really an interesting time to be alive, because we're actually discussing these issues. We're discussing our own imminent extinction and actually having the discussion about it. We are actually discussing this. And that, to me, is really important, that we're aware that we have been sold a bill of goods and that our participation is what the system needs to survive. And if we stop participating, if we stop cooperating with the system, it collapses. And the question is, how does that manifest? I was reading about the history of the Mayan civilization that collapsed about 900 AD. The Mayan civilization collapsed because one of the main reasons is because the kings were getting so greedy. This is after 2,500 years of a civilization. They were getting so greedy, the workers didn't get enough calories to do the work to feed the kings. And so what did they do? They went to the mountains. They abandoned the kings, and the kings starved in one generation. So, because they didn't have anybody else to feed them. And that's a model, I think, abandoning our support of the system, giving us new energy and new imagination to reconfigure ourselves. We will reconfigure ourselves in hundreds or thousands of local communities, call them bioregions, if you will, with watersheds. But it's really up to us. It's not up to us looking to the system. The system will not address these issues because they are making money on it and they own the politicians. Really, they own the whole political process. Why should we continue to validate them? That would be my question. It's just because that's what we're used to. We're used to. It's a habit. It's our pattern. It's easy, but it's not going to prevail. That system is, I mean, our participation in this system is, we have to recognize that it's complicity in a pathology. And we're better than that if we can get out of our heads and into our hearts and really grasp that we have what we need from an evolutionary perspective to radically change the way we think and live, but it has to be collective.
Brian, you and I were in Vietnam at the same time. I wanted just a short question. There are something like 20 veterans commit suicide a day.
22.
Pardon?
22.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think that we had that same problem. It occurred to me that possibly when we came back, there was somebody listening to us in some way. It was a lot of the nation. And I'm just wondering if you think this is a factor. These guys coming back, they've got nobody to talk to.
Well, in 1983 to 85, I was director of a Veterans Outreach Center in Massachusetts. And in that period of time, I know 12 veterans that committed suicide right in my community, Franklin County, Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that far more veterans from Vietnam committed suicide than were killed in Vietnam. It would have been more than 58,000 plus. More than that would have committed suicide. I don't know that it's a recent. I didn't have anybody to talk to when I came back except Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And I discovered them by accident. But when I discovered them, it was like manna from heaven. You know, it was like, wow, I don't have to explain anything to these people because they know what I'm talking about. I mean, I couldn't talk to my family. I couldn't talk to my high school classmates. They thought, I mean, they just didn't have the frame of reference of that experience. So I think that war is so pathological. When you go through basic training, they start weaponizing your soul. That's what I say. And they teach you to demonize the enemy. And when you demonize a group of people, you dehumanize yourself. And when you dehumanize yourself, you easily can become a monster. And that's what happens. We can so easily, as Camila Mejia says, I lost my moral compass. They don't want us to have a moral compass. They train us not to have a moral compass so that we can do their bidding and kill. What was I doing in a village 9,000 miles from my own village, as I say in the film? Well, that is totally absurd. I'm in somebody else's village. They've never been further from their village than maybe 10 kilometers. And I'm 9,000 miles from my village in their village. I mean, there's something, how easily we have in patriarchal societies for the last few thousand years, how easily we obey vertical authority structures and figures. But it's like what happened to our soul, or what happened to our sense of understanding the whole context that we grew up in, or weren't taught when we grew up. The context of the history of the world, the history of indigenous people, the history of how many generations of people were raised where the child is never separate from the mother for 2 or 3 years. They're not even in cribs or baby carriages. They're on the body of the mother. And that is so important in developing a sense of context with a moral compass. It's not cognitive yet, but it's deeper than that. And I just think capitalism is the worst possible system we could possibly have, and all the social problems we see are all symptoms of a political economy that doesn't care about anything but money.
We're afraid to deal with the inconvenient truth of the national security state, which is more powerful than the elected government.
I come back to my premise that we, the people, furnish the political and economic fuel that breeds and requires imperial policies, because our collective lifestyle is dependent upon burning huge amounts of carbon, which is basically oil, and that we can't separate our lifestyles from the policies. We can say the military-industrial complex is very evil, the Pentagon maybe the most evil building in the world, but all these institutions are creations of human beings. They weren't created in a vacuum. And so I think I come back to saying we have the power. We have the power to bring down the system and create a new one. And the question is, will we have the imagination and the creative energy to do it, especially if we can say we no longer are going to be distracted by the absurd political system and the election system in the United States, which is really just, to me, a huge distraction from real creative, energetic, vital activities, which our future is dependent upon.
Another Vietnam vet in the back. What I'm getting more and more disturbed about, having survived the survival, is people coming up and saying thank you for your service. It's starting to really draw pain from my guts.
I know.
And I'm at the point now where I ask them if they've got 3 minutes to hear what I have to say after they thank me for my service. Most of the people I knew over there, and I was a diver and EOD person trained by SEALs, most people over there that I knew weren't serving anybody. They were trying to stay alive.
Right.
They were trying not to harm anybody. They were trying to recover at night from what they'd done during the day. This is not active service for our country. This is active coping for yourself. So I want to set the record straight with people who have a moment to demythologize their silly comments. Most of us weren't serving our country. We were trying like hell to stay alive.
Well, I'm just finishing a book with Becky, co-written with my partner, called "Please Don't Thank Me for My Service." When I go to the VA, which is my healthcare system, it seems like almost every time I'm there, when I'm leaving the doctor's office or the nurse's station, they say, "Oh, by the way, thank you for your service." And I have to stop and say, "Please don't thank me for my service," because it wasn't service. It was disservice to humanity. And it's just a pro-war statement is what it is. Just keep on, keep on, keep on, keep on, thinking the same way so that we can have more and more wars. It is really, I know all my vet friends feel the same way you do. It's so annoying. It's so irritating. It's so really invalidating because, you know, those of us who are talking about it we're truth tellers. We're trying to tell the truth about the war. Thank us for that maybe, but not for our service. So it's pretty irritating.
I can't disagree with you about the election system being a circus. I just had to comment about
That's
that
good.
because of the way you were dissing the political system.
I know that a lot of people don't agree with my position, so it's good to have a good full discussion on it. Things have happened. Things have changed since 9/11 too. The rhetoric in the nation is much more right-wing. I feel like I'm back in the McCarthy era. I grew up in the McCarthy era. I thought it was a great era. I mean, saving freedom from communism. But when I look back, I realized, holy Toledo, that was really a brainwashing time. But I think there's virtually no independent politicians these days. virtually none left. They're all owned by the big money. Virtually all of them are owned. They're dependent upon the big corporations for their campaigns, and and you could look at Hillary and Trump and say, wow, you could almost argue that Trump would be better than Hillary because he might not get bipartisan support in the Congress, whereas Hillary will get bipartisan support in the Congress. I mean, that would be one. I'm not advocating voting for them, but you could argue that Hillary will have bipartisan support, and we know she's a war hawk, and Trump would not have the same kind of bipartisan support. So, if there's any semblance of checks and balances, you could argue that Trump would be better than Hillary, but I'm not going to argue that any of them are worthwhile. I think, there's some role in getting out information if you have that position, but the President of the United States and the Congress of the United States are not independent entities supporting human rights or the needs of the people. They are supporting a imperial plundering system to maintain 4.6% of the world's population with a third of the world's resources. That's what we are. We are 4.6% of the world's population consuming a third of the world's resources. Now, the only way that can happen is through force or threat of force. And that's why we send in the Marines. And Noam Chomsky calls it the fifth freedom. You know about Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The fifth freedom that we really take seriously is if some group or entity or sovereign nation interferes with our ability to get something we want, we send in the Marines. That's the freedom we really protect. The right to plunder and pillage wherever we need to go to maintain our way of life, and the obscene profits for the 1% that comes from this kind of activity. And we wind up giving them our money and our validation and our taxes and our votes. And I'm simply suggesting that at this point in history now that we've been sold a bill of goods. I know our middle-class way of life is very conveniently protected by this system. That's the problem. But it's not going to prevail.
Do you have an opinion on Jill Stein?
But I think she's good. I think she's better than, she's better than the other candidates. I mean, Bernie never talked about the wars or the military-industrial complex. He was good on domestic issues that people wanted to hear. And then we have to stack the chairs.
I was just curious, how did the idea of this movie come about? Who started this idea, and can you just quickly tell me how it ran? Because we never talked about that.
Yeah, it's a very simple story. I was on my book tour in 2011 when my book was published, and I was actually in Massachusetts. I was staying at a little cabin in Essex. While I was traveling around New England, there was a person that said, look, you can stay in this cabin and you can go to New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine from here. And she read the book in 2 or 3 nights. She couldn't put it down. She said, I called a filmmaker friend of mine and told him that he should consider a film about your life. And within a few days, that filmmaker had contacted me. And that was in November of 2011. And he has been working on it ever since until he got a final draft in May, I think it was, of 2016. So almost 5 years. I mean, and then, of course, I've had many meetings with him over the years. And the associate producer, Frank Dorrell in Los Angeles, has had a huge impact on the film. And Susan Utel, who's the editor, a genius at putting the story together.
And it's very timely when I have a computer on my person here that can follow me everywhere I go as I drive back to Corvette. Thank you.
Thank you.